what does that mean, interrupting racism?
Yeah, so I think for me, interrupting racism really means dismantling and breaking apart, interrogating, better understanding systems that primarily work against Black and Brown kids. That's kind of in a nutshell. It's certainly much more complicated than that, as I think, practitioners learn and supervisors and directors learn. The system is very complicated. So figuring out ways where, we can really investigate and figure out what are all the parts in this educational system, in our institution, that are harmful to Black and Brown students in particular, and then go through all the strides, get the education, the knowledge, the language, the skills to take that apart and then figure out how to rebuild it. It's a very complicated process, and one that I think Rebecca and I are constantly learning how to do and redo. But ultimately, it really is creating better schools for all students, that all students are going to benefit from the work of interrupting racism and creating healthy, uplifting, and affirming school communities and communities for kids, for children.
Okay, okay, and I think that makes sense, and I appreciate the definition there and for explaining. Now, the title of your book is "Interrupting Racism, Equity, and Social Justice in School Counseling." I want to throw this to Rebecca. Now that Alicia has kind of defined what does it mean to interrupt racism, what does that look like in a school counseling context?
Well, I think one of my favorite things about being a school counselor is that we get to work with the whole school and to see patterns in the way that our school is structured, or the way that we treat students, or the policies, procedures, systems, and structures that we have within our school building, in a way that I feel like no other role gets to do. Even administrators, that's why they became administrators. They want to lead the building, right? But they often get so mired in the minutia of. I remember one time my principal told me that she was in the middle of an argument between two staff members about pie in the fridge. So, they get really mired in this minutia of running a building, that, the bathroom is broken on the second floor, et cetera. So we get to see kind of this big picture. We're not working with students only in our one classroom, and we can notice things. And hopefully we're also hearing from students in a way that other staff members may not be hearing them, because we are able to form a deeper relationship with them, either through individual counseling or groups or whatever. So we have this great opportunity and great onus to interrupt those racist practices that might be embedded in the system that we're in, that many people might not even notice.
Okay. So this is like, I like these answers that I'm getting, because it's leading me to the piece that I was really excited about, as far as the policy audit. So once we start to kind of notice these type of things, or maybe I should just throw this out to Alicia. What is it? How does that all relate? Okay, so we talked about interrupting racism. We talked about from a school counseling context, but where does a policy audit fit into this whole piece there?
Yeah, sure. So, and Rebecca does a great job of like breaking it down step by step. I kind of am like in the weeds of it. So I'm just like, I share what my everyday experience is as I'm trying to make sure that I'm following the step by step. Because there can be, ways of guiding school counselors through this process of really examining and auditing your policies. So I'll give you a great example. So we are in the midst of scheduling. And so that means that at least at the high school level, the secondary level, high school counselors are working with students on the classes that they want to take next year. So I was working with a student, a Latina student, and we do not have a large representation of Latino students at our school. It's a very small population. And this one student in particular is really interested in STEM. And she wants to take this honors STEM class, and was not recommended for it because the policy is that students have to be recommended by a current teacher, and her current
Wow.
teacher did not recommend her for that class. So that class is pretty much off the table for her. And so she and I had a conversation about it. And usually when sometimes things seem unfair or inequitable or just not okay in the school environment, sometimes we get really fired up. I know I get really fired up trying to figure out what exactly is going on here. I need someone to explain this to me and help me understand how this is or isn't helpful for students. And so then I went through a formal process. And so I pulled data for some of our honors and AP classes to look at the numbers. And so I was able to disaggregate for race because we keep that data in our system. I was able to disaggregate for gender. I couldn't pull out for zip code, but that was another thing because our district is so small. Most of the students come from the same couple of neighborhoods. So I looked at this data, I went through it. It was very predictable. As you know, many districts struggle with access to rigor, and Rebecca and I have talked about this a lot throughout the years. And so I took this information to the leadership team and I said, hey, I had this conversation with the student that led to me wanting to explore this data a little bit further. And so it's kind of like a step-by-step process. And now we're relooking at the policy and trying to get a sense of how this needs to change because it's keeping some of our brown kids out of these rigorous classes.
Okay, Rebecca, why don't you add to that as well?
All right. So Alicia gave a great example of how she used data, which is what all of our stakeholders care about. So nobody cares about your feelings. They want to see the data behind what you have to say. So in Alicia's case, the policy is that you need to have a recommendation. In the district where I work, we have what we call open enrollment, where students can register for any course that they're, there is a certain like order. You've got to take the prerequisites or whatever, but there is no recommendation system. That's great, right? That's making some progress in a policy that often prevented students from joining more rigorous courses. But the practice is sometimes, not everywhere, but the practice sometimes is, okay, but the honors or AP teachers might stand up in front of the class and scare the lights out of all the kids about how hard this class is going to be. And then you get a whole bunch of kids dropping, or they have a pre-test that they use to try to push kids out. And so you might have a policy that makes sense, but a practice that isn't supporting the spirit of that policy. So you can do a policy audit both ways. You can do the official policy, but you can also say, okay, let me look at the data because maybe no one's done it yet in the way that Alicia did. And let's start looking at how this looks like. Let's look at some kids that we feel like could do really well. Are they enrolling in these courses? Is there a barrier that's preventing them? And then going from that perspective, I think is important as well.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Now, I like Sylvia's comment here. In my experience as an administrator, I make the move to change the process immediately. Then I look over data to change policy. That's
we can't
interesting.
do that as counselors. We don't have the power.
We don't have that authority.
So we have to do it the other way.
Yeah.
So okay, and that makes sense. Unfortunately, a lot of administrators are very keen on the data first, like prove to me why we need to look at these policies. And so, collecting that data, I think, is really important. Now I guess so when I pull the data, and anyone can answer this question, but when I start to pull this data, or first of all, maybe I should even ask, before we pull the data, what kind of things should we be looking for that would make us want to pull the data? Does that make sense? Like what are some of the signs, if you will, that we should maybe do a policy audit?
Well, I can share just, every different school communities are going to contextualize this differently, right? Because my school community is very, very specific to the neighborhoods that surround it. So The school where I work now is very, very different from the high school that I attended. It's very, very different from the K-8 school that I attended. Because in those, in public school districts, you're generally pulling from the community around you, unless you have policies and procedures where you're pulling from many different types of neighborhoods. So my context, at least in terms of racial demographics, is we have about half of our student population is white, a quarter identifies as Asian, and then the other quarter, I would say, is maybe half Latino, half Black. So it's about half of our school population, people of color, and the other half are white students. So proportionally, I'm thinking about how many students, if we have a true and proper representation in all levels of courses, about how many students should be in our honors level courses, how many students from different racial backgrounds should be in other types of STEM courses and art courses, if it's a true representation of our school population. So knowing that, and then looking through my students' the roster for that particular class, I could see, and I know most of these students, and I could see for the different sections that there were no people of color at all in those classes. And so for our context, right, that's unusual, or that shouldn't be the case, because, if we're saying that, all students are capable, then that shouldn't be the case. So immediately red flags. And so, that is what led me to start pulling more data for the rest of those classes and doing some comparisons there, and then taking that to the leadership team.
So just so I'm clear on what I thought I heard, sound like I heard demographics about 50-50, right?
Yes.
White students and students of color.
Yes.
But then the honors courses, there was no representation of students of color at all.
Not at all.
Okay. Rebecca, did you want to chime in?
I would only add that I think sometimes the way you know that you need to look at the data is just by listening to the kids and their parents and what their experiences are, because sometimes that will tell you more information about why that's happening. In this case, we strongly think is probably due to that teacher recommendation. But without the teacher recommendation, it may have something to do with how welcome someone feels in that room, in that space, or how, included they actually feel once they're in the space. And some students may be electing, they might have the rec and then not do it because they're just like, I clearly am not welcome there, and be in a protective way for themselves. So I think having that voice from parents and students is so important too.
Mm-hmm.
So then let me ask you this, Rebecca, should that policy be done away with? The whole idea of the recommendation, should that go away? Or do we need to talk about maybe implicit bias with our teachers? What do you think would be the solution when we're doing, okay, I did my policy audit, looked at the data, I see that there needs to be something that needs to change. What needs to change?
I mean, if you're asking me about my personal vote, I'd take away the teacher rec.
Yeah.
Because the counselor, when they're meeting with the student, if the student is failing all their courses and they decide, I really feel like I can do AP, whatever, the counselor could have a conversation of, are you sure that's what you want to do? You're failing every single class you're in. But, if that's not going to happen most of the time, kids know what they can do and not do. And so I think really the emphasis needs to be on encouraging kids to do more, and the kids that are struggling, supporting them to maybe get to that point. So that would be my preference. I don't know what Alicia would vote. She's the actual high school counselor.
What do you think, Alicia?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually surprised when I first realized that this is really primarily the only point of entry into some of these classes. That was shocking to me, and I shared that with my team. But when folks are in their school communities for a really long time, sometimes they don't necessarily see it from the outside looking in. And I've been at a couple of different schools at this point, And that is the first time that it has been such a stringent policy for access. And so I would also love to do away with the recommendation. I think the students' grades themselves sort of recommend them into different types of courses. And it's certainly a conversation that we have with every student anyway, when we're building out these schedules, just as I was speaking with this particular student. So I would love to do away with that policy. I don't foresee that happening this school year, but I do see the baby steps leading up to policies that are a little bit more inclusive.
There's no waiver system?
There is a waiver system, but by the time the waiver system is enacted, we've already created the sections. There's no space.
Okay.
Look at that.
Look at that.
There's some really good comments coming in, by the way. Sylvia says, I found that honors GT and AP courses have most bias policies in school. And I, as a former special ed person, director, as a person who was, trying to work on, we were looking at getting a gifted and talented program started as well at my school. These programs are gatekeeper programs. And so I agree with the two of you, and man, there's some good comments coming in. Shout out to Dr. Jabbers here. Here's the thing. I like to get away. I think we should get away from the gatekeeper process, teachers required, because we see a lot of teachers will put their favorite students, hey, favorite student, or hey, straight A student, you pass all my tests, so I'd love for you to join. I'm teaching this honors course. You should join. Mm-hmm. I see that happening, right? Mm-hmm. However, this is the other thing I want to add to. So I say get away with it, but then I also see a lot of our kids aren't educated or even encouraged to, or know about, or families know about these courses that are even offered and the benefits to these courses. So not only, I think, should we get away from the required, I need to be recommended, someone needs to write this or fill out a form in order for me to enroll in these courses, but also we need to make sure we're educating families about these courses that are available and why they should be available. Alicia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I love being transparent and really working with families so that they are a part of the process, that they are a part of the conversation, so that they have the information that they need. Usually when I work, I would say 9.5 times out of 10, when I'm working with parents, they are incredibly reasonable and just really want what's best for their kids. And they know a lot of times what happens within the school walls stays within the school walls, right? And the decisions that we make and who contributes to those decisions. But when working with families, I really try to be as transparent as possible to make sure that they trust that we are also really trying to make good decisions alongside and on behalf of their students. So when we explain, some of the details of certain classes and concerns we might have with students in one particular area or another, most of our families, they get it. They just no one from the school has ever really explained things, how it works on the inside. If you're an educator, you get the acronyms, right? You know all the acronyms, you know who to talk to if this doesn't work or that doesn't work, because this is our world. But a lot of families, if they're not educators, it's not their world. And so just sort of opening a window so that they can kind of, just take a peek in and see the work that we're doing and why we're doing the work in this way, I think is really, really helpful for building those relationships and developing that trust.
Thank you. Rebecca, did you want to add to it?
We have some schools in our district who've done some amazing things to really open up that window into honors and AP coursework. Student panels that have students of color, assigning students mentors at their first honors or AP course, like another student who's older than them or more experienced, I guess, in that coursework. Maybe they're both the same grade, but I think anything that we can do I don't think they're going to go away. I saw someone say in the comments that, like, I get it. It's an issue. And if you've listened to things like Nice White Parents podcasts and things like that, the history of AIG certainly is very embedded in racism and trying to attract white parents to schools. So, you know, and me, Rebecca Atkins, I probably am not going to be able to change that, but I can interrupt it by empowering my students and my families to know what their choices are and to help them to make the best choice for them.
Nice.